these guys that go through high level sports systems, through their career and their lives, and they never had a really good foundation of flexibility to begin with. And they kind of just keep up. They try to keep up in their training, and they get pigeonholed into this um, genetic disposition. So, yeah, you're just genetically inflexible. Just do your best to maintain what you have, and hopefully nothing bad happens, which is really unfortunate. I found myself in the same situation over the years, and I think part of my journey, the way I share it, is to showcase that this isn't true. We just don't know what the fuck we're talking about when it comes to training flexibility. So, Daniel reaches out to me this spring after season ends, and just gives me a little overview. The last couple of years, he's been really trying to make an effort to improve this. And when you get to that stage where you're kind of like at a loss of like, man, like nothing is working. This is 2 years of him like really isolating mobility and making that his priority and seeing almost no change. It gets so frustrating. And most people give up, right? It's just you accept that I'm genetically, not gifted in that area, which there may be a small component to that, obviously, but not to a point where I think it's not to a point where you can't get up in the morning and touch your toes, right? Like, that's bullshit. So we got right into it. We had, off seasons are generally 3 months. He had a little bit more than that. So we had around 100 days to like just get into the training, and we had to start right away. So got in there, got some baselines on where he's at. And that's just not movement, right? Like, obviously, if someone like reaches out to you and says, "Oh, I'm really stiff," you're not going to expect the movement to be good anyway. Like, I had no expectations going there, and I wasn't going to use any of his movement analysis in a way that made him feel bad about the already situation he knows about. It was just to collect information for myself. Also to give him some baselines, because he needs to know what he's working for. Everyone that trains, if some kind of performance measurement is in place, which improving flexibility was our performance measurement, you have to know what you're working for. And that's what everyone messes up with, and why no one commits to the mobility stuff, or that they just don't have good baseline measurements set in place to say, like, this is your benchmark, this is where we're getting to. So a lot of it was just educating him on that, changing his mindset around like, okay, this is what we're going to start with. Here's some expectations of, improvements, giving him that experience. This is what I usually see. 3 months, 100 days, it's a good time frame to make some change, especially if someone hasn't trained the qualities in those ranges of motion the way that it's presented, right? So he had a busy schedule as well. Like, one of the things that we were not so worried about, but like, can we work this around my already sports specific training schedule, right? So anyone at that level is going to already be working with a strength conditioning coach. They're already going to be doing sprint days, run days, lifting days. How can we make both work? The shitty thing is, like, most people that are trying to improve their mobility in that scenario, they just start going to like yoga and shit, right? Like, oh, I'm going to go do all this soft stuff because it's going to improve my recovery. But of course, there's going to be no change in range of motion because there's not an intensity elicited to a point where we would have adaptations occur. So I did develop a good relationship with the S&C that he was working with, and he was very open to what we were trying to do. So we looked at both programs. We, ensured that we weren't overlapping on certain movements. We were giving his adductors, hips, and groin enough time to recover between sessions. Movements weren't being replicated in both sides. Gave me a chance to choose the appropriate exercises on my end. And then we split everything up a little bit more accordingly. So, with a higher intense schedule like that, he obviously has all the time in the world. We trained 4 days a week. 4 days a week is a good expectation I have with most people, 3 days, 4 days, where you're just doing some supplementary work outside of your usual training. And at the end of the day, that just needs to happen. If you're that type of person who's like, hey, I've tried everything, nothing's worked, have you made isolated time to train this way at a really good intensity? No, right? It's all that soft, basic mobility stuff that does fuck all, unless you already have the range of motion. So once all that was established, had a good upper lower body split, and shit just started clicking. Intensity education was the big one. Specifically in exercise prescription, like what intensity are we working at, and really understanding how to push himself every week. Because the other category that guys like him fall into is when they're frustrated and they're really trying to change range of motion, is they will start to push themselves too hard every single session, maxing out a stretch. No different than maxing out a lift. It's just you're not gonna have a good time. Your body's gonna retaliate and withhold you from getting in a deeper range of motion. So when you find yourself in that experimental phase where you're like, I'll try this, I'll try that, it's like, it gets overwhelming to a point where there has to be a collaboration with a coach that can at least set you straight. Like this, okay, you need to put intensity here, and this needs to happen at this intensity for this amount of time. So we use like 3-week blocks. So 3 weeks of familiarization work, making sure that you feel like you understand everything, and then a bit of a 3-week bump. Let's bump for 3 weeks. So then I would come in, reassess, and we would make changes where we needed to make changes to make sure intensity is built across the board. So, over the 100 days, he had a massive improvement in his hip qualities. Specifically thinking about hockey players, like hip qualities in a wide base, you need that, right? So it's like if you're having like groin tweaks and those things like that happening, like as you're getting older in that sport, you need to start exploring ways to train those outer range positions at a higher quality. So substantial changes there, just in his ability to have access to passive tissue qualities. And this is a big one. It sounds lame, but that's really what you want. And it's also why you haven't had success in improving your range of motion, because you use too many passive specific exercises, but you don't have passive tissue qualities. So hopefully like that makes sense. So think about it. If I use higher intense active flexibility exercises, and we know what happens or what's supposed to happen in a good stretching protocol, so there's supposed to be isometric contractions happening. If we're using the right exercises that allow those higher intense isometric contractions to happen, it creates a relaxation effect in the lengthening tissues. So when someone tries to do like a basic ass couch stretch or a groin stretch, and they're like, I don't feel anything, nothing's working, because you have no passive tissue qualities to make use of that. So when you see Daniel's change in ground movements, it's not because I just like gave him a heavy kettlebell and was like, yeah, move around on the ground. That would have fucked him up. It was an outcome from these active flexibility sessions, these loaded stretches, all of this higher intensity work, allowing him to sit in passive tissue positions better, like allowing the passive tissue qualities to be trained. So as that improved, he was able to relax in positions, move his hips, and just learn how to use it. Because the opposite end of the spectrum, you have all the passive tissue qualities, hypermobile individual, you don't know how to use it, right? He's opposite to that. Daniel also had shoulder issues. He had surgery a few years back from a bad hit, and obviously hockey players spend more time working on the lower body base stuff. So we did bring a lot of shoulder stuff into the picture. Specifically, we did a lot of loaded hangs. We did a lot of just basic hangs. And the hang is the best, in my opinion, upper body loaded stretch. Most people talk about hanging for the benefits and qualities of like relaxing, improving your spine, building. It's a loaded stretch. If you're doing it properly, if you're understanding how to align the bones and create a higher intense stretch, adaptations will occur. And then you can just add weight on top of that. It's like silly. And no, Doing pull-ups won't take care of that because we need quality time in the stretch position. If you're doing a pull-up, you're getting almost no quality time in the stretch position unless we're accentuating the bottom as much as possible, right? His spine, it was huge improvements in spinal movement, flexion and extension, lateral flexion. And a lot of this was in with regards to the flexibility work we were doing on his trunk. We still have a ways to go here, but we specifically were doing some stretches on his abdominals, on his obliques, lateral movement work, getting him to understand how to move the spine, which requires passive tissue qualities through the trunk, through the hips and quads. And as he was getting that, he was understanding sternum movement, shoulder movement, and how to actually move his spine. So the freedom gained in extension, he wasn't even able to get his arms behind his head. So obviously we had some improvements through the shoulders, just like we did in the hang, which that's another thing to think about. If you're improving in one area, we want to observe how it's helping other areas. So if we're seeing freedom of movement in his shoulders now, we should start to see freedom of movement in the shoulders and other exposed positions. So his low bridge position improves substantially. And we're just going to keep moving this through the course through the in-season. So his in-season will change slightly because it's harder to get sessions in with the travel and all the new environments. But our main goal in season is now we want to maintain the qualities we've gained and slowly introduce new benchmarks, right? So you get those benchmarks at the start. We're hitting all these things. We're touching our toes. That was another one. He's touching his toes every day now. Like he can get up, warm up, and touch his toes. And he had never done that before. Like, again, what's going on here? How are we educating our athletes so that they can stay in the sport for the long haul, right? Every professional athlete should be able to wake up in the morning, warm up, and touch their toes. It should not be an issue for him, so we got him there as well too. But now we're trying to set new benchmarks. Where do we go from here? I don't think you'll see him in the splits. It's not really necessary, but he's learning to understand the qualities of splits, which is important because if you're ever exposed to those positions, you want to understand them. And we're going to seamlessly find ways to use his range of motion in his traditional training. So, this is where a call needs to be made at some point, probably within the next year. He may not be working with me specifically because he's able to integrate things into what he usually does. Or maybe I'm just consulting and helping him maintain that kind of setup. But ultimately, for athletes like this is where they should get to. You come in, you have that intervention with a specialist. If the specialist is doing their job, their goal isn't necessarily to make you hang on to them like, oh, I need that person, but to fix some shit, educate, and allow him to continue excelling at his thing. If he wants to do the splits or something like that, obviously that'll be a different intervention. But let's see how the season goes and